So just a reminder for those of you who have been attending or have never attended, this is a weekly series that's organized by the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. And the aim of the initiative is to bring together brain science and business in an effort to improve business, drive new discoveries and applications, and enhance the education of future leaders. We're based at the University of Pennsylvania. And of course, this weekly video conference discussion series focuses on a topic that has neuroscience and business implications that are what we hope are of broad interest, that are also relevant to current events. I'm Zab Johnson. I'm the Executive Director and Senior Fellow at the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative, and I co-moderate these sessions with Michael Platt, the Faculty Director of the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative and Professor of Neuroscience, Psychology, and Marketing at the University of Pennsylvania. So today's theme is on the neuroscience of communication. Before I briefly introduce today's panelists, just a reminder to put questions that you might have into the chat window and to keep yourselves muted if you are not invited to speak in order to make the video conferences as effective as possible. And the chat window is on the right or the left side of your BlueJeans window, depending on whether you're using the browser version or the app. And we'll try to get to your questions. And it's also really helpful for us to know what questions are the most relevant to the conversation and which might have already been answered during this discussion. If you write them there, then it also helps you to remember your questions. And we try to take sort of participant-related questions in the last segment of our discussion. So let me briefly introduce today's panelists, but they will also introduce themselves as they each begin to speak. So our first panelist is getting some feedback. See if we can turn that off. Great, thank you. Our first panelist is Carl Maugeri. He's the Senior Associate Director of the Wharton Communication Program and teaches public communications at the Fellows Institute of Government at the University of Pennsylvania. Carl's efforts in large part have been helping leaders and future leaders learn to convey their ideas, vision, and values clearly and convincingly, and be more persuasive while also being genuine. Our second panelist is Kristin Schultz. She's an assistant professor in persuasive communication at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. She's a Penn alum, having earned her PhD at the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania, working with Emily Falk in the Communication Neuroscience Lab. Her research focuses on the neuroscience of persuasive communications, largely to lead to behavioral change for better health outcomes for individuals as well as groups, as well as the neuroscience of why and how we share information. Our third panelist is Moran Cerf. He is an associate professor of marketing at the Kellogg School at Northwestern University. Moran received his PhD in neuroscience at Caltech, and much of his work is focused on how we use neuroscience to make content more engaging and optimize decision-making. He's also the Alfred P. Sloan Professor at the American Film Institute, where he helps screenwriters and filmmakers learn to communicate science more effectively. And finally, our fourth panelist is Suzanne Dicker. She is a senior research scientist at New York University in the psychology department and a member of the art science collective Dicker and Oostrich, and is a consultant on a growing number of art, science, and technology projects. Her PhD is in linguistics, and her work merges cognitive neuroscience, outreach and education, and performance art in an effort to better understand human social interactions and bring neuroscience out of the lab and into the real world, which is something that we are incredibly enthusiastic about doing as well at the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. So to get us started, I will have each of the panelists give a brief introduction of themselves and their work and thinking that's relevant to the theme, and we will start with Carl.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm very, very excited to be part of this discussion today. My perspective is going to be from the lay application area in this, and I wanted to do three things with this time. I wanted to give you a sense of how, as lay practitioners, we are applying numerous strategies to help business leaders to cut through the noise, to become more impactful in their persuasion. Also, I wanted to look at how some of the things that we're wrestling with as we think about communication and making communication strategy relevant in the environment that we're in, with not just COVID and not just the reflections on our race relations and things like that here in America, but also the whole idea of using factual information to persuade, and why is that problematic? Why can't we just convince with spreadsheets and numbers, and how do we achieve meaning for those ideas? And then I'd like to end with just talking a little bit about what we feel we need from neuroscience, from the lay perspective. What is it? What are some of the? I mentioned, I think this is it's a frontier for our perspective on communication. There's a lot of people. You hear a lot of communication instructors referring to mirror neurons and kind of a superficial understanding of what's going on, and I think that's a good thing, in that there's the application of science into what we're trying to achieve in the classroom to build better leaders. People see the connections, but it has to be done in a much more effective way. The understanding is, we need to bridge that understanding from the research scientist to the practitioner. I feel that's an exciting area that neuroscience can be helpful in too. So let me just go back and tell you just very briefly about our program. We teach about 860 MBA students, first-year MBA students, who come in from a variety of levels of preparation as communicators, in addition to all of the other areas of experience they have. Some come in terrified of and believing that they're walking into a public speaking course. Others feel very confident, and I hope learn that persuasion is that the theories of persuasion and the ability to modify that as a lifelong skill is captured too. But we really do try to remind them that when we think about this, the very first schools were schools of rhetoric. This idea of how ancient and how modern these problems are of creating meaning for our audiences, and the approach of using language to frame an idea. Now I realize that as researchers, we're looking at. The researchers are looking at the kind of the mechanics and the science of that. We're looking at it as a technique, as something that an applicable skill. So I think that's another area to probe as far as bridging these two important areas. The other thing is that there's some really interesting validations of the importance of the affect in being persuasive now that I think were not as necessarily as apparent even a year ago. One of the examples we like to use, or I'm just starting to use now, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, very, very wonderful communicator. Actually didn't know until fairly recently that she studied communication as part of her preparation, and brings a very young perspective. But what I think is so impressive about her is that she is very comfortable using affect and emotion and human connection. At the same time, it doesn't diminish her ability to take forceful, directive leadership decisions. So the potential contrast that someone who doesn't think too much about this would see, touchy-feely versus the iron fist. There is a middle ground that I think is so important for leaders to explore now, and with this, given her levels of success, and not just her, but a number of even female leaders who are coming to the fore in the COVID issues is very, very interesting. And I think that we need to, we're trying to draw from that, but we need, in pairing with neuroscience to understand better how this works is a very interesting idea. Let me contrast that with, again, this is not an experiment, but I remember early on in my, when I was beginning to teach this, and we use videos, of course, to put things under the microscope and look at various examples of leaders. This was a Ford executive some years back who had, his job was to talk to the people who had been left behind after a massive layoff at Ford. His job was to energize and organize, kind of get recommitment from the team that had already just been devastated. And it was fascinating because what he did was, so many things that we would find in some of our textbooks on communication. He used visualization. He spoke about being frank with the audience. He used metaphor. He used a number of other just, vocal variety, all of the things that we might say are a checklist for good, effective communication. And I played this, and then I was expecting a debrief from the students. I was expecting at least a mix of reactions, and the immediate reaction was very much a cynical, ironclad, I hated this, and it was this sense that he was coming across as slick or polished. So I'm thinking, here's everything in our textbooks and everything's in our readings that tell people how to be more effective in breaking through the noise and communicating with people who are already at a specific emotional level of concern and perhaps mistrust. And the reaction from the MBAs was this almost unanimous. They could pick out some of the techniques, but so when you contrast that with Jacinda and this idea that what our audiences are looking for more is human. They want accountability at the top. They want clarity in the response. How do we get at those things? We start with Aristotle. We start with some of the things that have proven true over thousands of years. We have the Frank Luntz and the workshopping of language to say how do we make things stick, and yet we're still wrestling with this idea of manipulation versus discussion and enlightenment and arriving at a better solution. So that's the area that I think is most promising for us to be working in, and I think the most needed is bridging that area. Many students don't remember Bernays and the idea of engineered consensus and what propaganda really is, and why is this a continuum of how do we affect our audiences to achieve an understanding that we as the speaker or the communicator want to achieve. And I think that we really can work toward reframing that goal of a leadership goal of arriving at a better solution, rather than just I have to get my ideas across because I want these people to do what I want them to do. So on that level, that's where we're working. So what does communication need from neuroscience? I think that one of the things, certainly the problems are glaring. Facts are considered relative in public discussion. How do we cut through that noise? I think how do we understand our audiences better? And neuroscience has such an important piece for us lay communicators to understand. We know that audiences. We might say that audiences are dynamic, but what is going on in their minds? How are they processing this? What is it? Why does a frame work? Why is it that we can say that we're looking at everyone's looking at the same facts, or I can say that the way we frame a particular idea has a different impact on people. At the same idea, but it can create a different impact. So helping us to understand better the what's going on in the dynamic of our audiences, and how can we still understand that better so that we can frame better and not just manipulate so that we can flip a switch and persuade, but rather we can get to potentially better answers and more communication in the way we think of it in a more idealistic way. And then I think the tools, instead of just, we work with the elements of persuasion, but what are the elements of understanding? What can neuroscience teach us and help us to implement that allows us to understand better how people are making decisions? I know this work is taking place, and I'm hoping that we can be forces to kind of bring that even to the forefront so that it can be used by the lay practitioners in a way to, again, arrive at better solutions.
Great, thank you very much. We'll move on to Kristin. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Kristin Schultz. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm just going to give you a brief overview of sort of where I'm coming from as a scientist. Specifically, I have sort of two perspectives. On the one hand, I'm a health communication researcher, meaning that I'm particularly interested in how we can use communication, like mass media campaigns, but also interpersonal communication and social media to persuade people specifically to behave in a more healthy way on a day-to-day basis. On the other hand, I'm a neuroscientist who's interested really in the nitty-gritty of what Carl was just describing, namely, how do people make decisions, and specifically, how do they make decisions when they're faced with various types of specific information, such as information about what types of behavior are healthy and what types of behaviors they should be engaging in, such as social distancing or smoking or drinking and these kinds of things. So more recently, we've tried to move into the direction of what Carl was just asking for as a practitioner, which is to try to link what we learn from the brain and about decision making to sort of more practical recommendations of what can we then do with that type of research. So specifically, we use our sort of interpretations of what we see in the brain activity while people are making decisions and while people are being exposed to persuasive messages. And based on these interpretations of what's happening in the brain, we can then start to build new manipulations that would engage exactly these types of decision-making processes that we think are effective in persuasion. And then test effects of these manipulations on behavior, which has two positive outcomes. One, it helps neuroscience because it validates our interpretations of what we see in the brain data. And two, of course, it hopefully helps practitioners a little bit because it helps to actually influence sort of real world types of behavior. So to give you a little bit more of an idea of sort of the types of specific research questions that we're interested in my lab, we study what I call sort of the social life of messages. And what I mean by that is we're interested in what happens when a message that is sort of carefully crafted, right, like a mass media campaign, like a TV ad or a poster, what happens when that message enters the community? So for instance, what happens when people see it on TV? What happens when it comes across your social media feed? What happens when you see it in the newspaper? So, and there are sort of two specific things that we're interested in. One is, will people talk about the message, right? Like, to what extent are they motivated to tell somebody else about it? These types of behaviors are really important in sort of determining how far-reaching the message is, so how many people are exposed to it. And then on the other hand, we're interested in, if they do decide to talk about it, what do they talk about, and do they talk positively about the message or negatively? So in the past, in some research, we have seen really scary negative effects of where people talked about messages in great length, but they're essentially making fun of them and thereby essentially leading to boomerang effects that were definitely not in the interest of the communicators. But we've also seen that when people really positively talk about these kinds of messages, they can really amplify the campaign effects and really lead to stronger changes in attitudes as well as behaviors. So I can already sort of give you a little bit of a spoiler that so far we know a lot more about what makes people talk and why. And in my lab, we've done a bunch of research about this that maybe we can talk about today. We know a lot less about how to influence whether people talk positively or negatively. So that's still a big open question. That's kind of exciting. But to close off my sort of short introduction here, why this is really important, especially in the current situation that we're finding ourselves in with the COVID pandemic, is that, of course, we've all seen the massive amount of misinformation that is being shared on social media and that's coming across on the internet and face-to-face conversations. And so understanding why people share messages with each other and how they talk about them is crucial to really sort of steer the response of a whole community to this kind of pandemic, because it really influences which messages spread. So is it the high quality information that they need to know, or is it the fake news kind of information that we don't want to spread? And then when they talk about the messages, how are they talking about them? So that's what we're busy with.
Thank you very much. All right, and we'll move on to Moran. Oh, we don't hear you, Moran.
Now you do. I'm a professor of neuroscience and business at Kellogg. So I teach MBA students how to use neuroscience in business, and I teach the neuroscientists how to use not just the understanding of the brain to talk to other neuroscientists, but how to find applications that could be communicated to the general public. And I think that in the context of our gathering, I also have two positions that I think would be relevant. And one is that I'm also a professor of screenwriting. I teach 1 quarter every year at the Film Academy in Los Angeles how to communicate science via film and TV. I worked on TV shows like Limitless and Mr. Robot, trying to basically put real science in ways that will communicate to masses. And in the context of business, which is, I know, something that we wanted to amplify here, I worked for 10 years in the Israeli high tech as a computer hacker, so I have some lens on what would work in terms of like what is relevant. So that is my background in the context of today. In the context of research, my research that's relevant is research that looks at how engagement works in the brain, or how engaging content actually changes our brain. And I wanted to tell you today about some of the learnings we had in a way that kind of would be tailored to something that you can use. So trust me that everything I say right now is backed by research, and if you want, ask me afterwards in the Q&A about the studies that led there. But I wanted to kind of really distill to you some of the messages that we learned that are relevant. So one of the things we learned in a work that is about to come out any day now is that actually when you talk to people, if you two are aligned by your personality, things would resonate better. As in we see by looking at the brains of people when they interact, that similarity in personality actually leads to understanding of things better. And it's interesting because a lot of times we share ideas with people thinking that we're aligned on things that are not personality. We talk to people of the same age, of the same gender, of the same race, of the same political affiliation. And what we see is that if you talk to a person who shares your personality properties, if you're an extrovert and they're extroverted, you might align better than if you're a Democrat and a Democrat, or people of the same age. So something like personality actually has neural correlates, and it means that you can communicate better if you understand the other person's psychology. It kind of intuitively makes sense. We talk to kids differently than how we talk to adults. We talk to people when we teach differently than how we talk to people in kind of the bar afterwards, but now we have neural evidence to the alignment of brain activity when we do that. So that is kind of one thing. If you can understand the other person's psychology and speak to them the way you would speak to a person with that psychology, it's likely that actually your brain entrainment would be aligned and you will communicate better. Generally, I thought that another tip that I learned from my research that I thought was relevant is that actually being boring is not a bad idea sometimes. We kind of think when we craft a lecture or a message that we should be interesting all the time, that should kind of always keep the audience engaged. And what our studies show is that if you look at a graph of kind of engagement over time, many good orators, we looked at Obama's speeches, at Martin Luther King's speeches, at Steve Jobs' speeches, they actually have moments where all the audience can't fall asleep. But what it does is it leads to the message that comes immediately after the boring moment resonating even more. So in a way, it's okay to be boring. The audience's brains need a breather every now and then, especially if it's a long speech. It's just that you need to control when this breather happens. You have to tell them somehow that right now is the time to take a breath, so the next thing is going to come up. And I give you a concrete example. When I give talks, I sometimes, in the middle of a talk, say, in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to speak to only those who really care about the math. So if you don't care about the math, take a mental break. This means that the few that actually care about that are now going to be even more engaged, and the others really understand that they don't have to pay full attention to the next 2-3 minutes. And then I say, okay, everyone comes back because now we're going to go to the next thing. Everyone is with me. So I know that whatever comes afterwards is going to work out. So in a way, controlling the engagement and the boredom is really helpful to maintaining overall the engagement of the audience throughout. And I'll give you a third one, and then I'm going to shut up because I wrote 10 of them, and I think that we're going to have room for others and you ask me questions. Another one is that summaries are really, really good. And that is not too surprising, but it is hard for a lot of us to do that because we're suffering from what I call the curse of knowledge. We know our field so well that we think that once we said it once, that's it. The words were said, everyone got it. What else is there? And I said it so beautifully because I know that this is the best way of all the 5 times I said it. And it's not the case for many other people. And therefore, I think that summaries that are framed as summaries, now I'm going to say the same thing I said before, are actually a perfect way to give people a chance to, A, make sure they understand it, so it kind of gives them validation. It also gives those who understood it the first time feeling of greatness because, oh, now I know what he's going to say and I get it well. It gives a chance for those who didn't, of course, to understand it better. And generally, it also kind of takes from a lot of words the few that are relevant so people know what in your mind is important. And many times this is not easy. Like, many times scientists or people that are experts in some fields, they give you numbers and they think that you understand what it means. They say 90% of people stopped smoking after this and this intervention. And they said it and they think, and then afterwards if they say, which is a lot, suddenly people understand. So if you give people the numbers, they might not know if it's a lot or little. Or if you say 90%, which is very little compared to, so those added summaries are really key to helping people stay with you throughout. So I gave you 3. I assure you I have 10. So if you want, I can go to others afterwards. But the point that I'm trying to make, and that I'm going to finish, is that the science we do actually shows us how engagement goes over time, and it leads to those insights, which I think are relevant to the people here who are interested in actually being engaging. So I think that the science here is the tool that will help all of you actually communicate better, which is, I think, one of the most important skills in our day and age. Thank you.
Thanks, Moran. We're big fans of using take home summaries at the ends of our sessions. So for those of you who have been part of our talks, it's good to know that there's backing behind that. All right, we'll move to Suzanne.
Let me unmute myself. So I'm a linguist and I'm a neuroscientist. I work at NYU and Free University in Amsterdam. And in my work, I try to bring neuroscience out of the lab into real-world environments to study how our brains support everyday social communication. So we go out to schools, museums, and other real-world social settings, and we measure people's brainwaves while they're doing their normal everyday thing. And then we find that the extent to which brain activity becomes coupled between people as they're interacting is related to learning, personality, which Moran also talked about already, cooperation, social closeness, and also eye contact. So in my work, we have been focusing on how those kinds of findings can be explained by 2 basic principles of the human brain that are pivotal in driving successful social communication. So First of all, our brains are prediction machines. We're constantly trying to anticipate what might happen next, and obviously this has evolutionary significance. So think about the ability to quickly generate possible next step scenarios when a bear comes charging at you, but it might also help with more mundane, everyday things that we run into, like being able to finish your partner's thoughts. And we find that if you're able to predict what another person might say, that will also help you synchronize your brain activity with this person, and down the line help you understand and interact with this person better. And the same is true for when a person might say this thing that you're able to predict. And that is linked to a second principle, which is that our brains and bodies are rhythmic. So our brain rhythms specifically are constantly looking for other rhythms in our environment that they can tag onto, like the actions or the speech rhythms of other human beings, for example. And this type of rhythmic alignment can then help us process things faster, build a common ground, feel bonded to other people. And so to illustrate with how conversations run, we know that rhythms and coordination in dyadic conversations are really, really important in how we experience a conversation. So when you take a turn, or even when you nod or say a little thing like, oh, or that follows very strict unwritten rules. And if you're just a little bit too fast, as per those rules of engagement, then you're sending a signal that you're interrupting, that you're being rude, or that you're exerting your dominance. And then if you're a little slower than usual, then the other person might maybe think that you haven't been listening or that you aren't interested, right? And I was, playing for a second with the idea of maybe conducting an experiment here that we all could do to illustrate how this work is really relevant to the current situation. But then I realized actually that most of you have probably already done this experiment in the past few months. So I think many of you have probably attended a Zoom birthday party at some point. And then think about specifically the moment where you try to sing happy birthday together, right? Now, one could call that a quote unquote failed real world social communication experience. So it's hilarious and terrible. And it's terrible because you cannot for the life of you sing in sync, right? And so the reason it's impossible, of course, is because of the time delay, and also, crucially, the variability in the time delay when you're communicating via Zoom or BlueJeans or phone even. And that makes it near impossible for our brains to adapt to this continuously time warping reality, so to speak. And so what's interesting and really important, and what I have noticed in my personal experience with this, is that many people are really surprised actually by how terribly impossible it is to synchronize your behavior online. And that shows, well, for one, that many companies are pretty good at minimizing the delay, but I think it also drives home the point that I mentioned earlier, which is how much of these rhythmic alignment factors, which are super important to social communication, actually play out their games kind of beneath the surface of our conscious awareness, right? And that's a possible problem because it makes us also really poor at diagnosing why a conversation might not seem to have run very smoothly. So we're tempted to wrongly attribute this to how likable or cooperative the person on the other line might be, or we think that we might be tired from a Zoom day. I mean, that's exhausting regardless, obviously, but we think that we were tired because of the content sometimes, whereas actually the exhaustion might stem from the fact that our brains are working in overdrive to try to accommodate to all these factors that are really working against how it likes to operate, but with another example being the lack of being able to make direct eye contact with people that you're communicating with, which is a very strong tool that we use to provide joint action and engagement when we're interacting face to face. And so as per Moran's suggestion, to summarize, our brains are predictive and rhythmic, and matching these predictions or rhythms will help us align our brains and promote possible successful social communication as a prerequisite. So that's what I had to say. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys. This is a really, really rich conversation, and there's so many different directions we can take this. But to step back and think about this a little bit more broadly, and I'm kind of maybe directing this at Carl and Suzanne. But what's the role of language in communication versus sort of everything else? I mean, sometimes we think of communication as just being the words we say, but in what you were saying, Carl, about kind of affect, and certainly what you were talking about, Suzanne, in terms of other components of communication. And so what's the relative importance of those different features, and to what degree can you rely on one or the other, or the whole thing has to come together into one package?
Be happy to start off. I think that I'm an English major. I was an English major before graduate school, and so when I think of the power of language and trying to help leaders understand what a difference that can make, I think of specific examples. I can say factually that murder is a crime. I can also quote Shakespeare, or I guess in this day and age, Bob Dylan now too, but murder most foul. And the experience of that idea is hugely different from that too. So what we're trying to do is leaders need to not just think about, this is the piece of information that I want you as my stakeholder audience to use or to be influenced by, but I need to shape it. When I can shape it in a more head and heart idea, then it becomes more powerful and sticks and potentially influences that listener to take action, as opposed to leaving with what I think was the impression I made versus what that person actually took from that communication.
I actually interpreted your question, I think maybe a little bit differently, as asking what the importance is of linguistic language as a tool to communicate these things, but maybe that's not the way that you intended it. And it's actually interesting because I haven't thought super deeply about that, because when I started researching this, researching language or as a tool of communication, the whole field was very focused on just language as human communication, and not so much on non-verbal forms of communication. So if you were using gesture, and that's specifically to my field of understanding how language drives communication, like people who were investigating the role of gestures, for example, they were really out in they were on the pioneer front or the fringes, depending on how you wanted to, how you thought about that. But from the research that we're doing, or the same line of research, there's some, there are some studies that, for example, compare when you're communicating with each other, either face-to-face or back-to-back using language, then we're finding that, at least for brain synchrony, insofar as that is one possible way that is a measurable index of coupling and communication, that people who are communicating back-to-back actually show much less of it than when they're communicating face-to-face. So the one thing that is obvious is that there's much more to communication than just the linguistic code in and of itself. And obviously we know of non-human animals that they use communication that is non-linguistic in nature and do it fairly well. I mean, we shouldn't really maybe go into exactly that line of conversation, but yeah, I don't know the actual balance of it, and I don't maybe other people here know of anybody who has studied this relative contribution of verbal and non-verbal communication. But
I could step with one thought on that. On trying to make it practical. I think that one of the group that is really, really good at that, in perfecting this ability to use body, timing, and communication, are comedians. So comedians have to hone their skills perfectly. And I think that in a way, is a way to practice communicating well for everyone is to practice telling jokes. I try to do it sometimes, and I think that this is really mastery, because joke requires timing. It requires a lot of theory of mind. You have to kind of see you have to understand the culture, what are the norms to violate them. So I think that if you get better as a very, very practical way in telling jokes, you will have mastered a lot of communication skills that are underlying all of those things that kind of Susan and Carl were speaking about. It's a very practical way to know that you're doing a good job if you make other people laugh.
Yeah, so to me, that's actually still the like the linguistic part of that linguistic code, right? The timing and playing around with those, like that interplay of like prediction and rhythm and doing that exactly right. Anyway.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by the ability of framing to change behavior. A small example, real quick example. I know that when I got to learn how students were admitted to Wharton, that the readers of the applications were told you are reading to admit versus reading to eliminate, and that small rhetorical construct changes the entire behavior of how someone approaches their job. So I do appreciate, of course, that all of the other aspects of communication, the verbal and nonverbal, and that, but the linguistic switch here seemed very powerful to me.
No, it's really interesting, and I love the joke telling thing. I think it's something that I'm trying to work on a lot when I teach. I don't think it works so well, but it's been effective, I think, at helping me to at least develop some rapport with the audience. I think it's always a good idea to try to do that. I actually have some friends in academia who begun working in trying to do stand-up comedy and improvisation, which I think is probably also a really useful tool. Kristin, I wanted to come back to you, and I think it follows on this a little bit. I mean, you can tell a joke and somebody might laugh, but for the wrong reason, or you might be telling something that's not a joke and somebody laughs at you. And you brought up this very disturbing trend of sort of messages getting promoted for the wrong reasons or misinformation going viral. And so I'm just wondering, within that context, maybe we just don't understand exactly what the message is or what is the signal, because people are doing multiple things at one time. They're transmitting information of one sort, but by communicating something, they're showing they belong to a certain tribe, or they're they're saying I'm part of this political movement, irrespective of what the sort of intended content of that message might be. And so I was wondering if you might discuss some of those ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a really sort of fascinating space. Like, we've recently kind of started to study something that we call sharing without reading, which is when people hit share on messages that they see on social media, like news articles, without reading them first. There have recently been some sort of like little social experiments that some websites and blogs tend to do, where they will sort of have their normal blog post, and at the end of it, they will tell people, if you read all the way to the end, please don't comment on it, just hit like and don't say anything. And then you see all of these like very detailed comments under these posts of people like discussing the topic when clearly they haven't read the article. And so recently we've been really interested in sort of what influences that kind of behavior. And indeed, what we find sort of influences sharing, or what drives people to share, are really motives that are not necessarily related to the actual content, right? So when people are sharing, they're engaging in a social interaction with somebody else. And so that social interaction is driven by motives that social interactions are always driven by, which is to relate positively to somebody else, right? To have a positive interaction, to maybe become better friends, and to present yourself in a positive way, right? So that other people get the impression that, oh, like, she's really well read or well informed, or she is interesting or funny or whatever it is that I want to be portraying. And so, yeah, I think in the middle of sort of these types of motivations that people are having, the actual content can sometimes get lost. But at the same time, I think we've recently also tried to sort of take advantage of that, based on sort of an understanding of what these motivations to share are, trying to promote high quality content about health and about other topics that we want to get shared often, by helping people to see how that content could help them fulfill some of these motivations. So how sharing this news article about COVID could help you appear like a helpful person that other people want to interact with, or something like that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really fascinating stuff. I'm going to throw out a question to the entire panel, and I imagine I'll get some different responses to it. So I think it could be a little controversial. Are there born communicators? Or is this something that's purely a skill that you developed, or is it, you probably, some of you will take the middle road and say it's something in between, but let's really, kind of swing for the fences here and ask the question whether they're really born communicators.
I'm happy to start. So I feel that there are some people that have mastery of their vocal cords and their body naturally. And as we heard here, these are part of communication. So some people are better at that to begin with, but like many things, this can be trained. I think I'm an evidence for that. I speak very, very fast. I think some of you may have thought that you have buffering issues, but it's actually just how I speak. You just had to slow down the computer. I have an accent. It's not my mother tongue. So there are a lot of things. And so for me to communicate, to teach, took a lot of work. And I think that the good news is that it's learnable. As in, I think everyone can become better at that. And I would say that the best way to do that is by viewing a lot of good people doing that. So kind of if we kind of take this perspective that we mentioned to earlier, the neuroscience one that says that actually brains align as they experience content together, your brains will actually entrain themselves to those of great speakers by doing that. So you can write notes on how to do it, but also by just sitting and viewing a lot of great storytellers, teachers, orators, and so on, you do that. So the answer simply is yes, some people are born with that, but what they're born with, I think, mostly are the toolkits. Like they actually have stronger voices, they have postures that are better, and so on. The message itself versus the medium is something that people perfect over time.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, that, some people are born with it, but that a lot of it you can definitely also learn. There are a lot of techniques you can pick up, and a lot of sciences already exist to sort of back that up, like what techniques work and what don't. But I want to add to that there's sort of a third perspective, which is that some types of communicators are more effective with certain types of audiences. So from communication science, for instance, we know that there are what we call source effects, right? So for instance, when you're getting a message from somebody that you think is more like you, you're more likely to trust that person and believe that person. And there are other sort of personality and just visual characteristics that have effects. Like, for instance, more objectively beautiful people, like, synchronous faces, and really clear skin and beautiful hair has influence on how persuasive you are, at least in sort of very short types of messages. Like, we're not talking about like really long, like political speeches or something like that, even though there are some physical characteristics also have effects, but especially if you're sort of communicating a very short, crisp message, then external characteristics can also have effects.
Well, I'm really sad that you included beautiful hair in that list of attributes. So these are really wonderful, and I'm mindful of the time. But I really wanted to get to this. Will go to Suzanne, but maybe the rest of you might take off on this and get to this notion of rhythm. That our bodies and our physiology are rhythmic. And I'm gonna just kind of throw two things out there. One is whether you can talk about rhythm and potentially music, if you've thought about it, in terms of entraining physiology and leading to something that has often been termed collective effervescence, going back to Emil Durkheim, this sort of feeling of like real oneness or togetherness. that would enhance cooperation. And the other is this idea of rhythm and entrainment. Brought to mind a friend of ours, Ralph Savarese, who has a son with autism who's now grown up. He's nonverbal, and when he was younger, the way that they helped him to learn letters and language was to actually play a strong rhythmic music and jump on trampolines with words on the wall. And so it's like this real actual physical embodiment of rhythm that seemed to help him to acquire language. And now he's still not verbal, but he produces language through writing, and quite lovely.
Yeah, so there's a really interesting and possibly complex interaction, obviously, between music and language and rhythm, and also actually going back to the topic of the previous question about what makes for a good communicator. So I was listening to Moran to link it back to that, and I was like, well, yeah, so you can learn from others, but you have to be able to actually entrain, like he talks about entrainment, and entrainment is really aligning your own rhythms to the rhythms, or the rhythms of your body or your brain to the rhythms around you. Otherwise, you're not going to pick up on those, on a lot of those cues, right? And so some of the work in our lab, for example, shows that, and it's a very simple task, like people were presented with strings of syllables, ta, 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 and then they were asked simply to whisper along with the string to say, to go ta, 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 ta. And there's two groups of people in our society, and that has been replicated in various groups. It's been replicated among kids in South America, not just undergrads at NYU, but in that group you see a bimodal distribution where half of the people synchronize their whispering naturally to what they hear, and half of the people don't. They're just all over the place. They're ta, 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 ta. And the people who are synchronizers, so to speak, also learn language, learn new words better. Like a novel, they recognize patterns as words, and they pick them up implicitly. And there's connections in the brain that are stronger also. And that links back to a lot of studies that have suggested that in language learning, synchronizing and music and rhythms, rhythmic entrainment to your environment is super relevant and important, and that there's links between all of those. And that also speaks to the social communication deficits in autism. Of the possible, it's super complex, and I'm not going to claim that is the answer to why social communication and linguistic difficulties arise in autism, but there are really interesting links there as well. When it comes to, for example, naturally aligning your rhythm. If you put rocking chairs next to each other, there's some famous experiments with that where you don't tell people anything, then you're naturally going to rock together. But if you put people who are farther on the autism spectrum don't do that naturalistic alignment. So alignment and rhythm are super important there. And the last thing about the music, there's also there's one study that I thought was really interesting when it comes to rhythm and the zone, or however you want to getting into the zone together if you're playing. And there was a drum circle study where people were they're drumming together, and then their brains were synchronizing as they were getting more rhythmic. And then you saw that this kind of drifted away as they were getting into this space, or have the vibe. And they were slowly drifting away, and then something caught them because they were, hitting the edges of the distribution where it still sounded good, and then they came back in. So it's all a flow of coming together, going into yourself, and then coming together again. So I hope that somewhat addresses some of your questions.
Yeah, no, that's really perfect. It's super fascinating. We could really take a deep dive into a lot of those questions. We've had a couple of questions in the chat, and this is something I would also like to ask you as well, which regards the kind of ethical and legal and other societal implications of using neuroscience and other tools to fine tune and persuasive messaging. So there's, there's obvious commercial applications. Can you create better marketing materials to push people's buy buttons harder, or can you create political propaganda that's more effective in insidious ways? So I wonder what you all, what your perspectives on the ethical issues are.
I feel very strongly about this because I think back to Bernays and the Torches of Freedom, how one person with a strategy was able to bring 50% of the population into the smoking world and create the sense of they're building this brand new market. So it is. I think we really do need to reflect on the ethics of what we're doing with our communication in a more effective way, and that's something that I guess that's two-pronged. One is, I guess, the basic ethics of the person, of the speaker himself or herself or theirself. That what is it that they how much responsibility do they feel to respecting the audience versus just getting their point across? So those lenses have to be put in place, and I'm looking for additional ways to think about, to actually put that into practicality other than sounding like someone just preaching.
I would say on that note that I'm extremely concerned about that. I think that we don't spend a lot of time talking about that, and the mechanisms by which science works is kind of driving forward the research without spending a lot of time on those questions. So I think in that sense, it's a fantastic question. And the answer is this gathering. I think that the more scientists spend time finding ways to communicate their research to everyone, speaking publicly about the concerns and actually putting them out there and finding ways to kind of navigate that by talking to people, it will become a question that everyone would be able to answer. It wouldn't be siloed in a lab. And I think that is basically the answer. So I'm concerned. I can give you my perspective on some research that I personally think is kind of taking us in the directions that I don't like as a citizen. And as a scientist, I also kind of have, conflicts within myself on what should and shouldn't be done. So I think this question, the fact that it was asked and the fact that we get to kind of address it here, is a perfect idea.
I would want to add that we would need an ethical code just along the lines of what people researchers do for DNA sharing, for example. Like there's been calls of that from like the Society for Neuroscience, especially now that we are more and more going into real world situations like workspaces to like oh, I just put like a headset on you and understand how you're not just communicating but how you're working. And people have a choice, but it's not entirely clear whether they actually do have a choice in certain circumstances, especially when it comes to those kinds of situations. Another example is that some of you might have seen where in China there were a couple of schools that had wired up their kids and basically based on brain activity or supposed brain activity, scolded them for not being attentive or sent messages to their parents. Like those kinds of things we need to all together think about and start feeling responsibility for. Like I do that kind of research in schools, and so what does the fact that I do that basic research mean for how people are then going out there and using those kinds of tools, right?
Maybe to just add like a little piece to that. I absolutely agree with everything that has been said. It's a big issue that I think we all need to be concerned about, but that also keeps getting more and more complex, right? The more sort of tools that we have to do science with. So for instance, more and more researchers are using mobile tracking data, so all the activity you do on your phone, or all kinds of physiological measures that could potentially identify a single individual that used to be anonymous in your study. And so these issues are becoming really, really complex, so that possibly like a single researcher, if you're just thinking about your own study and your own project, isn't necessarily equipped to fully understand and fully discuss always and fully tackle. And so at least at our department, but I also know at other departments, there are now more and more sort of initiatives to form groups and have like dedicated positions for people who help to grapple through these kinds of issues with technology and with data that is available about study participants. And so, yeah, fully agree that it's a highly complex issue that we need to sort of keep on top of, right? To make sure that the science is moving faster than that ethical discussion is.
Yeah, thank you. Those are thoughtful answers, and I think it also really underlies the importance of including everybody in this conversation. So scientists don't have a unique, perspective on this or purchase on it, and we need people who have training in the humanities and philosophy, and who've thought deeply about this and know the history as well. So I think that's critical. And I also, from my perspective, we don't really have a code of ethics that we've all signed on for, but I always go back to the report of the President's Bioethics Commission for the Brain Initiative when it was first launched, and it was chaired by Amy Gutman here at UPenn, and it does outline some really clear principles I think we would all accept, including consent and autonomy, and one that I think is really important that is almost never addressed, which is access and equity. So if only some of us have access to this technology or the training, et cetera, then that's only going to accentuate inequalities that we see across our society. So we're already over time, which is painful for me to recognize. But what we love to do is to ask our panelists sort of if they might share with us ways in which they're using their science, their scholarship, the things that they're learning in daily lives, especially right now, to navigate the complexities of the current world we're living in. So that's to all four of you, and feel free to not accept the challenge, but we'd love to get a little insight into your daily lives.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can just start with one of the things on a very humble level that we try to do with the students is kind of help them be confident as they face the challenges of standing up in front of people and trying to influence how they think about a problem and do all the things that communication requires. But on the other level, it's really incumbent on us to be, again, one step ahead of that and to be looking at what the wonderful things that neuroscience is telling us about audiences and seeing how we can incorporate that in expanding the way they think about communication. It's not just a one-way street. So that's kind of an area that I'm hoping to do more in.
Yeah, for me, our work has shown that it's really important, if we want important information to spread, it's really important for people to talk about it and to talk about it in a positive way, right? And so this has come up for me in personal life recently quite a bit, because I'm sure other people in this audience also recognize that sometimes you have certain family members that don't necessarily always sort of understand or recognize the importance of certain situations, for instance, about social distancing or wearing masks and so forth. And so I've been trying to consciously kind of have these conversations and try to slip in sort of some of the communication science findings that we talk about at work all the time. So for instance, trying to make these new behaviors that I'm trying to motivate, for instance, my grandma to adopt, to make them self-relevant to her, right? So that she feels personally that she's affected by the issue, and that she has new behaviors at her disposal to actually address them, and other things like that. So I've been trying to have sort of effective conversations with friends and family members.
So I generally think communication is one of the most important skills that we have to teach people right now. I think along with math and computer science, and maybe I can name 2 or 3, those are the things that every person has to be trained on, because the world we live in right now requires that. CEOs are now doing this quarterly messaging where they sell their products personally by standing on stage. Professors are required to kind of not just write papers, but actually find ways to communicate them. Politicians, I think, get elected primarily now based on how good they are on TV. So I kind of myself try to practice that a lot by really putting myself in rooms with audiences that I don't think would necessarily find my message interesting, and try to make them interesting, from talking to very young people, like kids, to talking to people that I think are hostile to my ideas. And specifically, I will kind of be clear, we now have research on what I think is the most risky thing in the world right now, which is climate change, one above all the things that are kind of bothering us these days, trying to find ways to communicate kind of that. And I'm using my research to actually look at ways to communicate to people that are hostile to the climate change, like people who deny it or are skeptic about it. And for various reasons, how do you make them care about that? So the paper I'm working on right now is how do you talk to skeptics about climate change and actually change their mind. And in doing that, I actually spend a lot of time with skeptics and with people who are not aligned with me on a lot of things, trying to really kind of get into their mind. And so I do it as something that helps me personally and also helps my research.
I'm really embarrassed. You cut out like right as you asked the question for me. So, and I'm just been trying to like discern what the actual question was from the answers. And I'm clearly not a great communicator, because I wasn't sure, is it how our work, how we're trying to use it in our personal lives, or?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. That's right.
So I like embarrassingly try to, like, in terms of actual personal life, like my relationship with my kid and my husband, I try to like lock the 2 worlds up, but like away from each other. But I do try to like link it back to some direct societal relevance. So we have a lot of, we're working with especially some of the things that we build, which I haven't talked about at all, which is ways that you can visualize synchrony between people. We have all these neurofeedback games that we've built that we're using in classrooms and in museums to like try to help people understand and think about what like makes you communicate with each other. And that has been like really, beautiful to watch, because it's a natural way of people to really be like, hey, what is it actually that makes me connect to the person in front of you? So you can have people holding hands or try to, bring back memories. And those are beautiful anecdotal moments. But they're also powerful in that we work, for example, with, we have a program where we work with underserved schools in New York City, and now currently also communities like Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is one of the hardest hit areas currently, both from socioeconomic and health perspective, to, really like all these platforms and like communication things that we've built into doing real world research to leverage those to try to help these kinds of communities, both in working on their on STEM and also on like figuring out ways that we can like use the tools to communicate their needs back to the city. So that's peripheral, but that's really where I feel like I'm doing something that matters more than the actual basic research that I'm doing.
Great. Well, we're definitely over time, and we're aware of people's precious time. So we will give you all a very warm thank you very much for spending the last 70 minutes with us. We've really enjoyed the conversation and the directions that we've taken with you all. Thank you very, very much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.